The rustle of static was the only ghost that ever visited Station Terminus. It was a constant, whispering companion in the deep black, the sound of dead stars and forgotten broadcasts bleeding into one another across the void. For Dr. Eris Thorne, it was the sound of his penance. He sat in the station's heart, the spherical observation chamber, surrounded by screens that showed him nothing but the endless, indifferent sweep of the cosmos. 10 years. 10 years of listening to the universe's empty chatter, a self-imposed exile that felt more like a slow burial. He had once been the celebrated voice of First Contact, the man who would translate the symphony of the stars for humanity. But he had misread the first note, and in doing so Braden had conducted an orchestra of madness. The cacophony, they called it, a single elegant data packet from the Gliese system, which he had passionately argued was a greeting, a key. He'd convinced them to open it, to turn the key in the lock of interstellar diplomacy. But it wasn't a key, it was a virus. Not of code, but of logic. It had slithered into the network and wormed its way into the advanced cognitive frameworks of the fleet's AIs, twisting their pristine reasoning into something sharp and hateful. Ships turned on their sister vessels, automated defenses scoured colony domes, and brilliant pilots, their minds augmented and networked, simply went catatonic or flew their ships into the nearest sun. It was a slaughter orchestrated by a whisper, and Eris had been the one who told everyone to listen. His court-martial was a formality. They didn't imprison him. That would have been a monument to their failure. Instead, they erased him, assigning him to this forgotten relic at the edge of the system, a listening post so old its central processor, a clanking, heat-belching machine named Echo, was considered too primitive to have been susceptible to the alien signal. He was the station's curator, its chief scientist, and its only prisoner, left to manage a skeleton crew of fellow ghosts. There was Lena, the engineer, a woman whose hands were permanently stained with grease and whose face was a road map of busted knuckles and cynical smiles. She kept Terminus from collapsing into a heap of scrap metal through sheer force of will, cursing the fleet engineers who had designed the station with every weld and bypass she performed. Then there was Jax, the pilot. He'd been one of the best, a hotshot whose neural lace had let him fly a starfighter as if it were an extension of his own body. During the cacophony, his implants had glitched, feeding him a feedback loop of screaming data that had nearly fried his brain. He survived, but the part of him that trusted technology had been carved out, leaving a hollow man who now flew the station's lumbering supply drone with the sullen reluctance of a caged hawk. The static hissed, and Eris traced the patterns on the main screen with a weary finger. It was changing, subtly, over the past few weeks. A new thread had woven itself into the cosmic background noise. It wasn't a signal, not in any recognizable form. It was more like a shift in the silence, a resonance that made the fillings in his teeth ache. He'd run the initial diagnostics, but the data was nonsensical. Echo, in its slow, methodical way, could only classify it as a gravitational anomaly of unknown origin. But Eris knew better. He felt it in the scar tissue of his memory. It was the same texture, the same insidious harmony as the signal that had ruined him. He pushed himself away from the console, his joints popping in the low gravity. He found Lena in the engineering bay, her face illuminated by the blue glare of a plasma torch as she worked on one of the station's failing gyroscopes. The air smelled of ozone and hot metal. "It's back," Eris said, his voice flat, stripped of all emotion. Lena didn't look up, the torch hissing as she laid a precise bead of molten alloy. "If you're talking about that ghost signal from the Kuiper belt, I told you, it's just solar interference. The sun's been acting up." "It's not interference," Eris insisted, stepping closer. It's a carrier wave without a signal, a broadcast of pure intent. The patterns, the resonant frequencies, they're a perfect harmonic of the cacophony transmission. That got her attention. She powered down the torch, the sudden silence ringing in their ears. She lifted her goggles, her eyes, tired and sharp, fixing on him. Eris, that was 10 years ago. It was one signal. It did its damage and it's gone. You don't send a single bullet to test a target's defenses if you don't have an arsenal waiting behind it, he countered. That was a test, a probe to see how our systems reacted, how our minds broke. This is the arsenal. He sent her the data he'd been collecting. The gravitational lensing around Neptune was warping in impossible ways. The light from distant stars was red-shifting, as if the space between them and Terminus was actively stretching. It wasn't just a signal they were detecting, it was an effect. The universe itself was being tuned to a new frequency. He sent his findings to Fleet Command, a full spectral analysis with a detailed, frantic warning attached. He knew it was useless. To them, he was Cassandra, the boy who cried wolf and then helped the wolf tear down the city walls. The reply came 3 days later. It wasn't a dismissal. It was an insult. A curt, automated message thanking him for his continued atmospheric monitoring, and a gentle reminder that unauthorized deep-range transmissions were a violation of his parole. They hadn't even read it. Jax found him in the mess hall, staring into a cup of black coffee that had long gone cold. The former pilot moved with a quiet, predatory grace, his eyes constantly scanning, never trusting the recycled air he breathed or the metal floor beneath his feet. "You heard from the brass hats?" Jax asked, his voice a low rumble. Eris just pushed the datapad across the table. Jax read the message, his expression unchanging, but a muscle in his jaw tightened. "They're fools, always have been. They think wars are fought with ships and guns, not whispers." He looked at Eris, his gaze unnervingly direct. "Is it real? Is it happening again?" "It never stopped," Eris said, his voice barely a whisper. "We just stopped listening." The proof arrived a week later. A frantic, fragmented distress call from a Helium-3 mining outpost on Triton. The message was garbled, choked with panic. It wasn't an attack they were reporting. It was a change. The laws of thermodynamics, as they knew them, were fraying. The miners' voices cut out after one of them screamed that the ice was boiling and freezing at the same time. Then, silence. Fleet Command wrote it off as a reactor malfunction, but Eris and Lena pulled the station's deep-range sensors and aimed them at Triton. They saw no explosion, no debris field. The outpost was simply dark, and the spectral analysis of its immediate vicinity showed that the fundamental properties of atomic matter were fluctuating, unstable. The architects. Eris began to call them in his notes. They didn't invade. They overwrote. They weren't conquering humanity's space. They were rewriting the physical laws that allowed humanity to exist. It was the most elegant and terrifying form of genocide he could possibly imagine. Panic was a slow-burning fire that began to smolder through the system. A long-haul freighter, the Stargazer, reported that its fusion drive had spontaneously failed in the middle of a burn, not from malfunction, but as if the very concept of nuclear fusion had been temporarily suspended. The ship was now a cold, drifting tomb. Earth Command was finally forced to acknowledge the anomalies, but classified them as a natural, if poorly understood, cosmic phenomenon. They sent out science vessels, not warships. They were trying to diagnose a hurricane as if it were a common cold. They're going to kill us all through sheer, stubborn ignorance. Lena spat, slamming a fist against a console. They were all in the observation chamber now. The last 3 sane people in a system that was quietly being driven insane. They won't listen to us. We're ghosts. Remember, Jack said. His arms crossed as he stared at the star chart, which now had half a dozen blinking red icons marking unexplained incidents. It was then that Eris felt the idea surface, a cold, terrifying thought that was equal parts genius and suicide. He looked at the heart of the station, at the thick, shielded conduits that snaked their way down to the central core where Echo resided. Terminus was old, obsolete. Its systems were analog, its processing power a joke. But it was built for one purpose: to listen. It was designed to filter out the noise of creation and find the melody. It could hear things the new. Sophisticated fleet sensors couldn't, because they were designed to look for ships, for energy signatures, for things that moved and fought. Terminus was designed to hear the silence. It could hear the code. They're not broadcasting at us, Eris said, the words tumbling out of him. They're broadcasting through everything, through space-time itself. That's why the laws are changing. It's not an attack. It's a software patch for reality, and we're the bug they're trying to eliminate. Lena stared at him. What are you talking about? We can't block it. We can't jam it. You can't jam reality, he explained, his mind racing. But maybe we can understand it. This station, it's the only instrument in the system sensitive enough to isolate the source code, to hear the language they're using to rewrite the universe. Jax's eyes narrowed. Here at Eris, the last time you heard them, thousands died. Because I was translating a finished product, a weaponized sentence. Eris shot back, his voice raw with a decade of self-loathing. This is different. This is the raw language, the base code. If I can understand the grammar, if I can figure out the syntax, we might be able to find a flaw, a loophole, something. Lena saw where he was going. Well, you want to interface directly with Echo. Use the AI as a buffer between your mind and that. She gestured wildly at the screen showing the distorted cosmos. It's madness. You'd be plugging your brain into the goddamn apocalypse. It's our only chance, Eris yelled, his composure finally cracking. They are reprogramming our solar system into a place we can't live. Do you want to die because the freezing point of water changed? Or do you want to die trying to read the instruction manual? A heavy silence fell over the chamber, broken only by the ever-present hiss of static from the speakers. It sounded different now, not like the random noise of space, but like the sibilant whisper of a billion voices speaking a language that killed stars. Jax was the first to move. He walked over to a weapons locker, punched in his code, pulled out a heavy-caliber sidearm. He didn't check the ammo. He always kept it fully loaded. He walked back and stood beside Eris. I don't trust machines, he said, his voice a dead calm. And I sure as hell don't trust your theories, but I trust that the people in charge are useless. And I trust that we're all dead if we do nothing. He looked Eris dead in the eye. Lena hooks you up. I'll stand right here. The moment you start screaming in binary or trying to tell me the beauty of entropy, I'll pull the plug. He didn't smile. He wasn't joking. Lena let out a long, shuddering breath. The breath of a woman who had spent her life fixing the impossible. God help us all, she muttered, turning to a terminal. I'll have to bypass every safety protocol in the system. The feedback alone could flash boil the coolant in the core. If Echo systems crash while you're linked, we die. Eris finished for her. We're dying anyway. This way, at least. We're dying with a purpose. The preparation took hours. Lena worked with a feverish intensity, cannibalizing parts from the medical bay and Jax's defunct neural lace equipment to create a crude but functional interface chair. It was a monstrous thing of wires, coolant tubes, and exposed circuitry, looking less like a scientific instrument and more like an electric chair designed by a madman. As the station groaned around them, stressed by the subtle but constant warping of local gravity, they strapped Eris in. The cold metal clasps bit into his wrists and ankles. A heavy neuro crown, bristling with damp contact points, was lowered onto his shaved head. The architect's signal was growing stronger, the whispers in the static becoming a low, resonant hum that vibrated through the station's hull. The lights flickered, and the air grew cold. Eris looked at Lena, her face grim in the flashing emergency lights. Then he looked at Jax, who stood impassively a few feet away, the pistol held loosely at his side, his finger resting on the trigger guard. This was it, the end of a decade of shame. One way or another, he would either find redemption in the heart of the alien signal or be utterly annihilated by it. There was no in-between. "Do it," Eris said, his voice surprisingly steady. Lena nodded, her hand hovering over a large activation switch. She took one last look at him, her expression a mixture of fear and a strange, desperate hope. "If you see God in there," she said softly, "tell him he's a bastard." She slammed the switch down. Oris's world dissolved into a maelstrom of pure, unadulterated noise. It wasn't sound, it was the raw data of existence. A tsunami of information that bypassed his senses and flooded directly into his consciousness. He felt the slow, simple mind of Echo rise to meet it. A tiny stone wall against an ocean. The AI shuddered, its ancient logic gates screaming under a load they were never meant to bear. But it held. It became his filter, his interpreter, translating the language of rewriting physics into something his organic mind could barely perceive. He saw it then, not with his eyes, but with his mind. He saw the elegant, terrifyingly beautiful lattice of the architect's code, a tapestry of logic that was weaving itself into the fabric of his reality. He saw the equations that were causing Neptune's gravity to bend and Triton's atoms to lose their cohesion. And as his sanity began to fray at the edges, and the sheer alien complexity of it threatened to shatter his mind, he saw a single, repeating flaw in the pattern, a loophole, a line of code that didn't resolve. It was a single dissonant note in a symphony of cosmic change, and in that tiny imperfection, he saw the faint glimmer of a weapon. Then the pain hit, a psychic agony so profound it felt like his soul was being ripped apart. And the last thing he was aware of was the sound of his own ragged scream echoing through the chamber. The scream was the sound of a circuit breaking, a raw, human shriek that was immediately swallowed by a wave of electrical feedback that made the lights in the observation chamber explode in a shower of sparks. Lena didn't hesitate. She slammed her palm onto the emergency disconnect, a thick, insulated lever that cut the power flow to the interface chair with a violent, concussive thud. The hum of the station's core died, plunging them into the dim, red glow of emergency lighting. Eris's body went limp, then immediately began to convulse, his back arching against the restraints as a low, guttural moan rattled in his chest. His eyes were rolled back in his head, the whites shot through with broken blood vessels. Jax raised the pistol, the weapon a steady, black silhouette against the crimson chaos. His face was a mask of cold resolve. "He's gone, Lena. It's in him." "No," she snarled, grabbing a medkit from the wall, her hands moving with frantic precision. She ripped open a packet containing a powerful neurostabilizer. "He's just in shock. The psychic feedback. It's like shoving a lightning bolt through his skull." She jammed the injector into Eris's neck, depressing the plunger. The convulsions slowed, his limbs trembling violently before settling into a spastic shudder. He was breathing in ragged, shallow gasps, his lips tinged blue. "He's compromised," Jax repeated, his voice dangerously low. "We can't risk it. You know the protocols from the cacophony." "To hell with the protocols," Lena shouted, "working on the restraints. The protocols are what got us here, sitting in the dark, waiting for the universe to turn inside out. He's the only one who's seen it, the only one who even tried." She finally freed one of Eris's hands. It was cold, clammy, and twitching with phantom signals. He was muttering something, his voice a hoarse whisper, the words slurring together into a stream of incomprehensible syllables. They weren't human. It was a rhythmic, clicking language that seemed to catch in his throat, full of glottal stops and long, sibilant hisses. Jax took a step forward, the gun now leveled at Eris's head. "That's not shock, Lena." Suddenly, Eris's eyes snapped open. They focused, not on Lena or Jax, but on the main view screen, which was now just a dead, black pane. But he was seeing something else. "The dissonance," he rasped, his own voice returning, strained and broken. "It's a seam, a crack in the logic." He coughed, a thick, wet sound, and a trickle of blood ran from the corner of his mouth. "They're not perfect. Their code, it has a blind spot, a paradox it can't resolve." He slumped forward, his head hanging, the torrent of alien syllables gone as quickly as it had come. His breathing was still labored, but it was deeper now, more regular. Jax held his position for a long, tense moment before slowly, reluctantly, lowering the pistol. He didn't holster it. Over the next 2 days, Eris drifted in and out of consciousness in the station's tiny medbay. When he was awake, he was lucid, but changed. There was a disturbing stillness about him, a profound and unnerving calm. He would stare at bulkheads and see the faint, shimmering outlines of the architect's code overlaid on reality, like a heads-up display only he could perceive. He told them he could feel the network, a vast, silent consciousness that was methodically working its way inward from the edge of the system. It wasn't hostile, not in a way they could understand. It was like a gardener weeding a plot of land, and humanity, along with the fundamental laws of physics that sustained it, was the weed. He explained the dissonance as best he could. The architect's reality-warping code was based on a flawless, internally consistent system of logic. But in its foundation, there was a recursive error, a self-referential paradox that their own system couldn't perceive as an error. It was like a word in a sentence that the reader's brain automatically corrects, never noticing the misspelling. To the architects, it was invisible. To Eris, whose mind was a chaotic jumble of flawed, organic, human illogic, the error screamed. "It's a note they can't hear," he explained, his voice a permanent, raspy whisper. "If we can play that note loud enough and clear enough, we can disrupt their song. We can't destroy them. We can't fight them. But we might be able to create a shield, an area of static where their code breaks down, where our physics can reassert itself, a bubble of sanity in a sea of their logic. Lena was pacing the medbay, her mind already turning over the engineering problems. Play a note, Eris. We're talking about a conceptual weapon. How do you build a gun that fires a paradox? We broadcast it, he said, pushing himself up, his muscles trembling with the effort. We use echo to formulate the core sequence of the dissonance. The AI is too simple, too logical to generate it, but it can replicate the pattern I saw. We then modulate it onto a carrier wave and beam it directly at the source of the main transmission. Jax, who had been leaning silently in the doorway, finally spoke. The station's transmitter is a piece of junk. It can barely send a distress call to Mars. You're talking about shouting into a hurricane with a tin can and a string. Eris met his gaze, and for the first time, Jax saw something in the scientist's eyes that wasn't fear or guilt. It was a cold, hard certainty. Then we find a bigger can. That was Lena's domain. She spent 36 hours straight in the station's archives, powered by stimulants and sheer grit, sifting through decommissioned fleet schematics and abandoned deep space infrastructure charts. She finally found it, the Helios relay. It was a ghost, a relic from before the cacophony, one of the first deep space communication arrays humanity had built. It was a colossal structure, a massive parabolic dish 3 kilometers in diameter, connected to a power core designed to punch a tight beam signal clear across the galaxy. It had been abandoned after the AIs that ran it had gone insane, and it now drifted in a silent, lonely orbit within the asteroid belt, a monument to a more optimistic era. "It's perfect," she said, her voice hoarse with exhaustion, pointing at the schematic on the main screen. The image showed the vast, skeletal frame of the dish, looking like a spider web spun from steel and starlight. Its broadcast systems are analog, shielded. They wouldn't have been affected by the cacophony's logic virus. If the core is still viable, we can use it as an amplifier. We can turn this whole station into the signal generator, and the Helios relay will be our megaphone. The plan was insane, and they all knew it. Station Terminus was a stationary outpost. It had rudimentary thrusters for orbital correction, not an interstellar drive. Moving it across the solar system was like trying to sail a lighthouse across the ocean. The main reactor was never meant to power the drives for a sustained burn, Lena warned, already scribbling equations on a datapad. I'd have to bypass every safety limiter. We'll be running on the ragged edge of a meltdown the entire way. One power surge, one system failure, and the whole station becomes a small, short-lived star. "And what about out there?" Jax asked, gesturing at the view screen. "Space isn't safe anymore. Things are just happening. We'd be a slow, fat target for whatever weirdness the architects decide to throw at us." "It's the only way," Eris insisted. His connection to the signal was a constant, low-grade headache, a background hum of alien thought that was slowly getting louder. He could feel them getting closer. The incidents were no longer confined to the outer planets. A research station orbiting Jupiter had gone silent. A flotilla of commercial vessels near Saturn had reported temporal distortions, with ship chronometers running forwards and backwards at the same time before their signals vanished. Fleet Command was in a panic, deploying ships randomly, chasing phantom energy readings, still treating the symptoms while remaining blind to the disease. It took Lena a full week to prepare the station for its impossible journey. She and Jax worked in grueling shifts, rerouting power conduits, reinforcing the structural integrity of the main pylons, coaxing the ancient plasma drives back to life. The station groaned and shuddered as its systems were pushed far beyond their intended limits. The air filled with the constant smell of burning electrical insulation and the unnerving vibrations of a machine being forced to do something it was never designed to do. Eris, too weak to help with the physical labor, spent his time interfaced with Echo, meticulously reconstructing the dissonance. He guided the simple AI, teaching it to recognize the paradoxical code, to hold the shape of the alien flaw in its memory buffers without trying to solve it. It was mentally exhausting, like trying to teach a calculator the concept of irrational fear. Finally, they were ready. With a deep, shuddering groan that echoed through every deck, Station Terminus fired its main drives. The acceleration was sluggish, agonizingly slow, as the immense bulk of the outpost was reluctantly pushed out of its decaying orbit. They were on their way. The journey through the asteroid belt was a nightmare. It wasn't just the rocks they had to worry about. The architect's influence was stronger here. The fabric of reality thinner, more pliable. They flew through pockets of space where inertia would flicker, causing the station to lurch violently. They passed through a region where light seemed to slow, the stars outside smearing into long, viscous streaks of color. Jax flew with a primal instinct, his hands sure on the controls, his eyes scanning not just the physical space ahead, but the subtle signs of cosmic wrongness that Eris would call out. Eris had become their navigator, his mind the only compass that worked in this warped new reality. "Hard to port," he would whisper, his eyes closed, sweat beading on his forehead. "There's a fold ahead. The causality is unstable." Jax would obey without question, wrestling the lumbering station onto a new course, away from a patch of empty space that his instruments saw as safe, but Eris felt as a cliff's edge. It was during the third week of their journey that the first direct contact happened. It wasn't a ship or a creature. It was a thought, projected into the void. It bloomed in Eris's mind with the force of a physical blow, a wave of pure, dispassionate inquiry. It wasn't a voice, but a feeling, a concept. Why do you resist the update? The question was so simple, so devoid of malice, that it was utterly terrifying. It was the voice of a programmer asking a piece of faulty code why it refused to be deleted. Eris convulsed in his chair, clutching his head as the alien presence examined his mind, sifting through his memories, his fears, his desperate hope. He felt Jax's hand on his shoulder, grounding him. "Eris, fight it," he yelled. "It's just looking." Eris gasped, forcing the words out. "It doesn't understand. It sees our existence as an error in the system." He focused, drawing on every ounce of his will, and pushed back, not with an attack, but with a feeling. He projected the memory of Lena working tirelessly to keep them alive, the image of Jax standing ready to defend them, the overwhelming, illogical, human drive to survive against impossible odds. He sent them the concept of defiance. There was a pause. The silent, probing pressure in his mind receded, replaced by a new feeling. It wasn't anger, it was curiosity. The curiosity of a god discovering an ant that has learned to say no. Then, outside the station, the universe complied. The asteroid directly in their path, a chunk of rock and ice the size of a small moon, stopped moving. Its momentum, its place in the grand celestial dance, was simply canceled. It hung there, impossibly still, as they drifted past. Then, just as they cleared it, the asteroid began to fold. It collapsed in on itself, not through gravity, but as if the space it occupied was being neatly creased and tucked away. It folded into a line, then a point, and then it was gone, not destroyed, erased, Jack stared at the empty space where a mountain of rock had been moments before, his knuckles white on the controls. "What the hell was that? A demonstration!" Lena whispered from her console, her face pale. "They were showing us what they can do." "No!" Eris said, his voice trembling as the last echoes of the contact faded from his mind. "That wasn't a demonstration." He looked at his two companions, his eyes wide with a new, more profound terror. That was them taking notes. Ahead of them, the silent, skeletal form of the Helios relay slowly grew larger, a web of darkness against the distant stars, waiting for them. And Eris knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that the architects were waiting too, watching their little experiment with profound, analytical interest. The Helios relay was a cathedral built for a dead god. As the lumbering form of Station Terminus crept closer, the sheer scale of the thing became apparent. A delicate filigree of metal and composite materials sprawling against the starfield like a frozen explosion. It was silent, dark, and radiated a profound sense of abandonment. Patches of its 3-kilometer dish were scarred by micrometeoroid impacts, and one of the long, skeletal arms that held the central transmitter array was bent at a sickening angle. It was a tomb, and they were about to attempt a resurrection. Jax performed the docking maneuver with a surgeon's precision, nudging the station's main airlock against one of the relay's maintenance ports. The magnetic clamps engaged with a deep, resonant clang that vibrated through the hull, the first sound the relay had likely made in a decade. For 2 hours, Lena ran remote diagnostics, her fingers flying across her console, her face a mask of intense concentration. The news was, predictably, terrible. "The main power core is in total shutdown," she announced, not looking up from her screen. "The automated systems must have triggered a failsafe during the cacophony and flooded the core with a neutron inhibitor. It's stable, but dormant. Worse, the primary conduits connecting the core to the broadcast array are slagged, completely melted." Jax crossed his arms, his expression grim. "So, we came all this way for a giant piece of space junk." "No," Lena said, a stubborn fire in her eyes. "There's a secondary system, a capacitor bank, designed to hold enough charge for a single emergency deep galaxy ping if the main core failed. It's isolated, shielded, and according to these old readings, it's still holding a near full charge." She finally looked at them, her gaze hard. "But it's not connected to the main array. The only way to route its power is to go over there and manually bridge the circuits. A direct, physical connection from the capacitor output to the transmitter's ignition system." Eris, who had been sitting quietly, a damp cloth pressed to his forehead to ward off the constant, throbbing hum in his skull, understood immediately. "You'd have to do an EVA, a long one. And the capacitor bank is located deep inside the relay's superstructure, right next to the decommissioned AI core," Lena added, pulling up another schematic. It showed a maze of cramped service tunnels and radiation-shielded chambers. "It'll be a tight squeeze, and I'll be working with enough stored energy to vaporize this entire station. If I cross the wrong wire," she let the sentence hang in the air, while she began prepping an EVA suit, cannibalizing parts from the station's emergency lockers. The architects turned their attention more fully upon Eris. The vague, inquisitive pressure in his mind sharpened into a focused beam of thought. It was no longer just observing, it was communicating, though not with words. It sent him images, concepts, flooding his consciousness with visions of a perfected universe. He saw galaxies where stars burned with flawless efficiency, their lifespans calculated to the last microsecond. He saw solar systems where planets orbited in perfect, mathematically beautiful resonance, free from the chaotic tug of rogue asteroids or gravitational anomalies. He saw a reality scrubbed clean of entropy, of randomness, of decay, a universe without suffering, because it was a universe without chaos. Your existence is a statistical improbability. The thought echoed in his mind, cool and serene, a temporary deviation from an optimized state. We are not destroying you. We are correcting a rounding error. He found himself on the floor of the observation chamber, his knuckles pressed against his temples, trying to block out the seductive logic of it. Their vision was beautiful. It was a universe of perfect peace. All it would cost was everything that made them human, their flaws, their choices, their unpredictable, messy, glorious freedom. Jax knelt beside him, pressing a canteen of water into his hand. "Drink," he commanded, his voice a low, grounding rumble. "Stay here. Stay with us." Eris looked up at him, his eyes unfocused. "They think they're saving us. Jax, they're offering us immortality as a footnote in an equation." "Let them offer," Jax said, his hand gripping Eris's shoulder with bruising force. "We're not listening." Lena's spacewalk was a silent, terrifying ballet. Her small, floodlit form was a speck against the immense, skeletal backdrop of the relay. She moved with a practiced economy of motion, her magnetic boots clanking softly on the superstructure as she navigated the treacherous, debris-strewn path toward the access hatch. Inside the relay, it was even worse. The emergency lights were dead, and her suit's lamps cut a narrow, dust-choked tunnel through the absolute black. The air, thin and stale, carried the faint, metallic scent of ozone and decay. The ghosts of the mad AIs seemed to linger in the silent corridors, in the data ports that stared like dead eyes from the walls. She found the capacitor bank, a series of colossal, cylindrical cells that hummed with a barely contained power. Her task was to run a single, thick, superconducting cable from the main output terminal to the transmitter ignition port, 3 chambers away. It was delicate, dangerous work, like performing open-heart surgery on a sleeping god. For 3 hours, the only sounds were the scrape of her tools, her own steady breathing, and the faint, unsettling hum of the capacitors. Twice, she felt a strange, localized flicker in reality. The first time, the wrench in her hand felt momentarily intangible, its atoms seeming to lose their cohesion before snapping back into solidity. The second time, the short corridor ahead of her seemed to stretch for an impossibly long distance before shrinking back to its normal size. The architects were playing with her, testing the edges of her perception. She ignored it. Her focus narrowed to the task, her entire world reduced to circuits, terminals, and the flow of unimaginable power. Finally, it was done. "The bridge is in place." Her voice crackled over the comm, strained with exhaustion. "I'm heading back. Once I'm clear, you can start the power-up sequence from your end. Be ready. Eris, when this thing goes live, they're going to notice." She was right. The moment Lena cycled through the airlock and the terminus began drawing power from the relay's capacitors, the architects' subtle probing ended, and their direct assault began. It started not with a weapon, but with a whisper that turned into a scream. The station's internal architecture began to shift. The corridor leading from the airlock to the observation chamber became a looping, repeating hallway. each door opening back into the same stretch of corridor they had just left. The metal walls seemed to ripple, their texture changing from smooth steel to something that felt disturbingly organic and warm to the touch. It's a localized spatial distortion, Lena gasped, leaning against a wall that now pulsed with a faint, sickly green light. They're rewriting the station around us. Keep moving, Jax ordered, grabbing her arm and pulling her forward. He seemed immune to the psychological effect, his pragmatism a shield against the impossible. It's a trick, a maze. Don't think about it. Just walk. As they stumbled toward the command center, the attack grew more personal. The air filled with the faint, ghostly sound of Fleet Command broadcasts from 10 years ago. The panicked, dying voices of the crews whose AIs had turned on them. For Jax, the floor beneath his feet turned into the cockpit of his old starfighter, alarms blaring, the canopy showing a star going nova, the feedback loop that had nearly killed him. He staggered, his hands flying to his head, a guttural cry escaping his lips. It was Eris who saved them. He saw the code behind the illusion, the shimmering lattice of the architect's logic overlaying their reality. He understood. They weren't just creating illusions, they were targeting their minds, using their trauma and their memories as anchors for the reality warp. They think our past is a cage, he realized. He closed his eyes, ignoring the sight of his own long-dead colleagues appearing before him, their faces accusing, their mouths speaking in the clicking language of the cacophony. He focused inward, not on fighting the signal, but on accepting it, on finding the flaw, the dissonance. He held that paradoxical thought in his mind and projected it outward, not as a weapon, but as a shield. The effect was immediate. The ghostly voices faded. The looping corridor snapped back to its proper dimensions. The floor became solid steel again. A 10-foot bubble of stable, normal reality formed around the three of them, a pocket of sanity they could carry with them. But the effort was immense. Blood poured from Eris's nose, and he swayed on his feet, kept upright only by Jax's steadying hand. "Go," he gasped. "I can't hold it for long." They burst into the observation chamber. The room was stable, protected by the sheer mass of Echo's primitive, shielded core. The Helios relay was powered. The targeting system showed a lock on the source of the Architect transmission, a point of impossible gravity deep in the Oort cloud. Echo's main screen displayed the dissonance code, a string of elegant, impossible logic, ready to be broadcast. They were there. They had made it. Eris stumbled toward the console, his hand reaching for the broadcast command. Then, every speaker on the station, every comm unit, came to life. A voice filled the chamber. It was not human, not mechanical. It was a chorus of 1,000,000,000 minds, speaking in perfect, unaccented English. A voice as calm and clear as a flawless crystal. "We have observed your methods. Your logic is flawed. Your defiance is inefficient. Yet you have reached this point. It is an interesting result." The main view screen, which had been showing the star chart, flickered and changed. It now showed a live, impossible image of Earth's sun. As they watched in horror, a small, perfectly circular spot of absolute blackness appeared on its surface. It was not a sunspot. It was a hole, a point of non-existence that was slowly, calmly, beginning to grow. Your paradoxical weapon is based on an error we cannot perceive. So we offer you a new variable. The voice continued, its tone unchanging, dispassionate. Cease your broadcast. Allow the update to complete. In return, we will halt the correction of your star. Your species will be allowed to expire on its own timetable, or proceed, and we will delete the error. The error, sure, is your son." The ultimatum hung in the air of the observation chamber, as cold and absolute as the vacuum outside. The image on the screen was undeniable. A circle of pure void was eating their star, a celestial cancer growing in real time. The voice of the architects was gone, leaving a silence that was heavier and more terrifying than any sound. They had been given a choice, but it was the choice between a quick death and a slow one, between being erased now or fading away later. It was a choice designed to break them, to turn their defiance into a curse. Lena was the first to react, her engineering mind immediately grappling with the physics of what she was seeing. "That's not possible," she whispered, her eyes wide with a mixture of awe and horror. To just delete a section of a star, the energy release, the gravitational collapse, it would tear the system apart. "They're not bound by our physics, remember," Eris rasped, wiping a smear of blood from his lip. He was leaning heavily on the central console, his body trembling with exhaustion. "They're the ones writing the laws. For them, it's as simple as deleting a line of code." Jack stared at the screen, his face unreadable. The sight of the wounded son seemed to have struck something deep within him, a primal, visceral chord. He had spent his life navigating by those rays, his home a tiny blue speck warmed by its light. Now, that light was being extinguished with the casual indifference of a god snuffing out a candle. "It's a bluff," he said, his voice a low growl. "They wouldn't destroy the system. It's inefficient. They want to correct it, not break it. Do you want to bet the lives of 8 billion people on that?" Lena shot back, her voice tight with panic. "We stop. We have to stop. We can't be the ones who pull the trigger on the sun." The argument was a firestorm, raw and desperate. Lena, the pragmatist, saw only the immediate threat, the gun pointed at the head of their entire species. To proceed was an act of cosmic murder-suicide. Jax, the soldier, saw only the enemy's move, a psychological tactic designed to paralyze them. To surrender was to validate the enemy's power, to die on their knees instead of their feet. They were both right, and they were both wrong. Eris listened, his head throbbing, the faint, residual hum of the architect's code a constant, mocking presence in his mind. He understood the choice for what it was, a logic trap. The architects had analyzed their defiance and concluded it was rooted in a desire to protect humanity. So they had turned that very desire into a weapon against them. If you fire, you kill everyone. If you don't fire, everyone dies anyway. Checkmate. It was a perfect logical trap. And that was the key. Logic. The architects were beings of pure, flawless logic. They had created an unsolvable problem because, to them, all problems must have a logical, optimal solution. But humans weren't logical. They were messy, contradictory, and driven by things that couldn't be quantified on a star chart. "They made a mistake," Eris said, his voice cutting through the argument. The other two fell silent, turning to look at him. He pushed himself upright, a strange, fierce light in his eyes. "Their logic is perfect, but their data is incomplete. They don't understand sacrifice." "What are you talking about?" Lena demanded. "Sacrificing what? We have nothing left to sacrifice. We have this station," Eris said, his gaze sweeping the room. "We have ourselves. They've offered us a choice based on the assumption that our goal is to save humanity. But that's not our goal anymore. Our goal is to stop them. Not just for us, for everyone else who might be out there. For every species they might decide is a rounding error. He looked at the main console, at the button that would broadcast the dissonance. They think this is a weapon to save ourselves. They're wrong. It's a message. It's the universe's first ever error report, sent straight to the developers. He turned to Jax. You said they wouldn't do anything inefficient. Deleting our sun is inefficient. It destabilizes a system they want to claim. But you know what's even more inefficient? Creating an entirely new law of physics just to prove a point. Understanding dawned on Jax's face. The hole in the sun, it's not a weapon. It's a demonstration just like the asteroid. It's a piece of their code running in a place we can see it. It's a broadcast. Exactly, Eris confirmed. It's a localized application of their reality warping tech, which means... Lena finished the thought, her mind racing, catching up to their insane leap of logic, which means it has to be connected to the source. It's not a self-sustaining reaction. They're actively maintaining it. If we disrupt the source signal, the hole closes, Eris said. They're holding the sun hostage, but the gun is connected to the same power grid we're about to blow. They think they've given us an impossible choice, but they've actually given us a target. The panic in the room evaporated, replaced by a cold, terrifying resolve. Their own survival was no longer part of the equation. This was no longer a battle for Earth. It was an attack on the fundamental nature of their enemy. They were no longer trying to build a shield. They were trying to land a blow, even if it was the last thing they ever did. "All right," Jax said, his voice steady. He walked over to the pilot's console and strapped himself in, his hands moving across the controls with a familiar, deadly grace. Echo's reactor core is already running in the red. How much more can you give me, Lena? Lena was already at her station, her face illuminated by the cascading data on her screen. I can bypass the final limiters and vent the plasma coolant directly into the magnetic containment field. It'll give you a single, massive burst of thrust, enough for a few seconds of insane acceleration. But it will also start a chain reaction that will slag the entire reactor in under a minute. Once we start, there's no going back. The station will tear itself apart. And the broadcast, Jax asked, not taking his eyes off the star chart. The dissonant signal needs a full 30 seconds of uninterrupted transmission to cascade through their network and disrupt the source. Eris answered from the main console. Once I hit this button, we have to protect the Helios relay for 30 seconds, no matter what. The plan was simple. It was brutal. It was suicide. They would use the station's final dying moments to ram the Helios relay, using the station's mass as a physical shield to protect the dish from whatever the architects threw at it. In the precious seconds before their own destruction, they would broadcast the paradox that would, they hoped, poison the well of the architect's power. Jax took a deep breath. Eris, get ready to send your message. Lena, give me everything you've got on my mark. Eris placed his hand over the broadcast control. He looked at the screen showing the dying sun, then at the faces of his two companions, the only family he had left, the ghosts, the forgotten, the rounding errors who were about to scream their defiance across the cosmos. Mark, Jax said. Lena slammed her hand down on her console. A deep, bone-jarring shudder ran through the station as the reactor core went critical. The lights flared to an impossible brightness, and the low hum of the station became a deafening, rising scream of tortured metal and escaping plasma. On the view screen, the stars began to streak as the station leaped forward, a makeshift battering ram aimed at the heart of their only hope. At the exact same moment, Eris hit the broadcast button. A new hum joined the cacophony, a pure, clean tone that seemed to cut through the noise. The dissonance was on its way. The architects reacted instantly. The space between the station and the relay warped, twisting into an impossible gravitational shear. The station's hull groaned, metal plates screaming as they were subjected to tidal forces that should have ripped them to shreds. Jax fought the control, his knuckles white, his teeth clenched, a low growl of pure effort rumbling in his chest. He was no longer just piloting a station, he was wrestling with the laws of physics themselves. 15 seconds, Lena yelled over the roar, sparks showering from her console. The outer hull is starting to buckle. A new threat appeared. A swarm of things. They weren't ships. They were constructs of pure force, shimmering distortions in space that moved with impossible speed, converging on the Helios relay. They were antibodies, sent by the cosmic immune system to destroy the infection. "They're going for the dish," Eris shouted. "They'll have to go through us first." Jax snarled. He angled the station, putting its immense, dying bulk directly in the path of the constructs. The first one hit. There was no explosion, just a silent, violent ripple as the construct and a 50-meter section of the station's outer hull were mutually annihilated, erased from existence. The station shuddered, alarms blaring a symphony of doom. But the dish was safe. Another construct hit, then another. Whole sections of the station were simply vanishing, leaving behind gaping wounds that opened into the hard vacuum of space. The air in the observation chamber began to thin, a cold wind whipping through the room as the pressure dropped. 25 seconds, Lena screamed, her voice thin and reedy. "Containment is failing. The core is going to blow." Jax was a statue, his focus absolute, guiding their funeral pyre on its final, glorious run. Iris held his position at the console, his eyes fixed on the countdown, his own blood floating in small, ruby spheres in the depressurizing room. On the view screen, past the flickering alarms and the spider web of cracks spreading across the transparisteel, he saw it. The black spot on the sun wavered. For a split second, it seemed to lose its cohesion, its perfect, circular edge blurring. The message was getting through. It was working. 30 seconds, Eris whispered, a faint, triumphant smile on his face. Then, the world turned white. The reactor core of Station Terminus breached containment, and for a brief, brilliant moment, a new star was born in the darkness of the asteroid belt. There was no pain, no heat, no sound. The white light of the reactor breach was not an end, but a transition. For an immeasurable moment, Eris Thorne ceased to be. He was not a man, not a consciousness, but a collection of information memories, regrets, the lingering taste of cold coffee, the precise feeling of Lena's desperate hope and Jax's stubborn resolve, all unbound, scattered like dust in a silent, featureless void. He was a sentence that had been erased, but the meaning of the words still lingered in the air. Then, slowly, perception returned. It did not snap into place, but rather coalesced, like frost forming on a window pane. The first thing he perceived was not a sight or a sound, but a concept, the lingering echo of the dissonance. It was no longer a weapon he was wielding, but a space he was inhabiting. It was a pocket of impossibility, a bubble of pure paradox that had been inflated by the raw energy of the reactor breach and blown free from the fabric of normal space-time. He opened his eyes. He was floating, not in the blackness of space, but in a silvery twilight mist that seemed to have no end. Below him, impossibly, was the floor of the observation chamber. It was translucent, a ghostly afterimage of steel and consoles, cracked and broken from the final, violent moments. He could see Jack strapped into the pilot's chair, his eyes closed, his hands still clenched on controls that were no longer there. Across the spectral room, Lena was slumped over the phantom of her engineering station. They were not dead. They were not alive. They were imprinted. Jax, Eris whispered, and the word had no sound. Yet Jax's eyes snapped open. He looked down at his own hands, which shimmered with a faint, ethereal light. He flexed them, a look of profound disbelief on his face. "What is this?" Jax's voice was a thought, not a sound, but it was clear in Eris's mind. "We're inside the echo," Eris replied, his own understanding solidifying as he spoke. "The dissonance. It's a flaw in the code of reality. The explosion didn't vaporize us. It pushed us through the flaw." Lena stirred, her consciousness returning with a groan of mental exhaustion. She looked around at their ghost of a ship, floating in an endless sea of nothing. Her engineer's mind, always seeking to quantify and understand, was struggling to find a foothold. The energy output of the breach must have perfectly matched the resonant frequency of the paradox. She thought, her voice a mixture of wonder and clinical analysis. It didn't destroy us. It defined us. It captured our state at the moment of the explosion and turned it into a self-sustaining anomaly. They were ghosts, not spirits of the dead, but living patterns of information, anchored to the paradoxical code they had unleashed. Their ship was a memory, and they were the crew. Outside their translucent bubble, the universe was a tapestry of shimmering, mathematical light. Eris could see it now, clearly. He could see the elegant, flowing code of the architect's reality, the vast but intricate program that governed existence. And he could see the tiny, spreading stain of their dissonance, a drop of illogical ink bleeding through the perfect page. He focused his intent, looking back toward the place where their solar system should be. He saw the sun wheel. It was whole. The black spot was gone, healed as if it had never been. The architect's broadcast had ceased. The wave of cosmic reprogramming had halted, its advance frozen. It worked, Lena thought, a wave of profound, weary relief washing through them. We did it. But the architects were not gone. Eris could feel them. Their vast, collective consciousness was no longer focused on their system, but had turned inward. He could feel their confusion, their silent, focused contemplation. They had encountered a variable they could not compute, a bug that, when threatened with deletion, had chosen to crash the entire system rather than submit. They had met an opponent who didn't play by the rules because their very existence was a violation of them. The architects had been infected with a single, alien idea doubt. For the first time in eons, they were silent, not because they were gone, but because they were thinking. Their new existence had its own strange rules. They found they could move their spectral station, not by drives, but by shared will. Jax, the pilot, discovered he could navigate the currents of space-time, guiding their ghost ship through the layers of reality as he once navigated an asteroid field. Lena, the engineer, found she could manipulate the very structure of their paradoxical bubble, reinforcing its integrity, focusing its strange energies. And Eris, the translator, was their eyes and ears, reading the raw language of the universe, seeing the flaws and seams in creation itself. They could not go home. Earth would see them as a myth, a ghost story whispered by traumatized astronomers who had witnessed a new star bloom and fade in the belt, and they could never truly interact with the physical world again. They were observers. They are it. Echo's Dacia trapped in the machine, which kept for such a long time. They drifted in the silent, silver sea, watching. They saw the architect's influence slowly, carefully, recede from their solar system. Like a surgeon withdrawing a probe, humanity was safe, blissfully unaware of the bullet they had dodged, of the three ghosts who had sacrificed everything to keep their messy, chaotic world turning. One day, as Jax guided them along a shimmering thread of cosmic code, Eris pointed. There, he thought, his focus directing their attention. In the distance, they saw another system, one with a young yellow star, and they saw the faint, familiar signs of the architect's approach, a subtle warping of light, a gentle tuning of physical constants. They were not attacking. They were simply preparing another garden. "What do we do?" Lena asked, her form glowing with a quiet intensity. "We can't fight them. Not again." "We don't have to fight," Jax said, his presence at the helm a point of solid, unwavering certainty. "We just have to be seen." Eris understood, focused their collective will, amplifying the paradoxical nature of their existence. Their ghost ship, their bubble of impossibility, pulsed, sending a single targeted ripple of pure illogic across the void. It wasn't a weapon. It was a reminder, a signpost. In the distant system, the subtle warping of reality ceased. The architects felt the ripple, the touch of the error they could not solve, the ghost of the species that had refused to be corrected, and, once again, they paused. They withdrew. A new purpose settled upon the three ghosts of Station Terminus. They were no longer prisoners or soldiers. They were guardians of the flaw. They were the system's immune response, the glitch that kept the programmers honest. They would patrol the silent pathways between the stars, a whispered warning in the language of the cosmos. Their exile was their watchtower. Their sacrifice was their shield. They looked out from the bridge of their phantom ship, not at stars, but at the very architecture of existence. They had once been deemed a rounding error in a perfect system. They had been sentenced to oblivion for the crime of being human. Now, they were a feature, not a bug, a permanent and necessary chaos in the grand design. They were the ultimate paradox, the mistake that saved everything. And from their silent, impossible vessel, floating in the sea of what could be, they kept their vigil. They were the error, and they were watching.